to the third part in our journey through the rise of the Islamic Caliphate and concepts associated with Islam that still affect our world to this day. Today we will examine the historical procession of war and conquering that led inextricably to the rise of the Knights Templar. Before we get started, please do me one small favor and boop the like button. Before crimson crosses and white mantles, before banks, castles, and whispered legends of secret rites, there were roads. Long, winding roads that cut through barren hills, tangled scrub, and heat-shimmering plains. The air was heavy with dust, and the cicadas sang in the noon heat. Pilgrims walked them in small groups, some barefoot, others in worn sandals, carrying humble satchels, wooden staffs, and small relics wrapped in cloth. Many had journeyed for months across seas and mountains, only to face their greatest danger within sight of Jerusalem's holy walls. Between Jaffa and the holy city, the path narrowed into defiles, where sudden raiders would descend in a swirl of hooves and steel. These attackers were merciless, cutting down the unwary and vanishing into the hills before help could come. At night, the road lay silent, but for the distant howl of jackals and the muttered prayers of travellers, who knew that the next dawn might be their last. In lonely towers of rough-hewn stone, small garrisons kept watch. The men there knew that their numbers were too few to stop a determined enemy. From their vantage, they could see far into the hills, where at dusk small points of fire appeared, too many to count. Somewhere out there, enemy eyes were also watching them. Word of these dangers spread through Europe, told by returning pilgrims in hushed tones, by merchants who had lost goods and men, by priests who spoke of the Holy Land's peril. This was a land contested for centuries, where empires had risen and fallen, and where Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for centuries. Out of the dust of these roads and the stone of these watchtowers, out of memories of conquest and exile, would rise a brotherhood unlike any the world had seen, monks who fought. Bound to poverty, chastity, obedience, and the sword, they called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The world knows them as the Knights Templar. To understand why they came into being, we must go back to the year 632, when the Prophet Muhammad died, leaving the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, to lead a young but fiercely united Muslim community. The campaigns that followed were swift and decisive, bloody and harrowing for those under the wake of onslaught. Syria fell. Egypt was taken from the Byzantines. Persia, the ancient rival of Rome, collapsed before them. In 638, Caliph Umar entered Jerusalem after a negotiated surrender. The Patriarch Sophronius is said to have mourned, "The abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place." By the early 8th century, under the Umayyad Caliphate, the Islamic world stretched from the banks of the Indus River to the shores of the Atlantic, through sheer barbaric force. In 711, Umayyad forces crossed the strait to Iberia and crushed the Visigothic kingdom. Muslim armies pressed into Gaul until halted at the Battle of Tours in 732. The centuries that followed were a long struggle for dominance along the Mediterranean. By the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks had emerged as a formidable Sunni power. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, their horse archers swarmed the Byzantine lines, loosing volleys of arrows before vanishing and reappearing on the flanks. Emperor Romanos IV was taken prisoner, and most of Anatolia fell in the chaos. Seljuk and Fatimid forces then fought over the Holy Land, making the pilgrim roads ever more dangerous. William of Tyre would later recall, "The road was infested with brigands, and the pilgrim who escaped with his life gave thanks as one delivered from the lion's mouth. Islam showed no mercy to those who did not follow Islamic rule of law. Everything and everyone in its path was relentlessly murdered. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to the west. In November 1095, Pope Urban II addressed the Council of Clermont, his voice carrying over the assembly. "Your brethren who live in the east are in urgent need of your help. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches. Let those who have been robbers now be soldiers of Christ. Whoever, for devotion alone, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance." The crowd answered with a cry that would echo for centuries. Deus vult, God wills it. The First Crusade was a trial of endurance and faith. In 1097, the Crusaders surrounded the city of Nicaea, raising timber siege towers and hurling stones by day and night. The defenders fought back with arrows, oil, and taunts from the walls. After weeks, the city fell, not to the Crusaders directly, but to the Byzantines who negotiated its surrender. Soon after, at Dorylaeum, the Crusader vanguard under Bohemond of Taranto was ambushed at dawn by Seljuk cavalry. Arrows fell in dark clouds, the whistle and thud of iron-tipped shafts cutting through the chaos. Surrounded, the Crusaders formed a shield wall, bravely and defiantly, holding off wave after wave until the main force under Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse arrived, slamming into the Seljuk flank. The enemy broke, leaving behind a field of shattered shields and fallen banners. The siege of Antioch began in October 1097, a grim and grinding trial that would last for 8 long months, and nearly destroy the Crusader army before they ever glimpsed Jerusalem. Antioch itself was an immense prize, an ancient city of stone walls and towers, straddling the Orontes River, guarding the northern gateway into Syria. Its fortifications were formidable, massive ramparts of cut stone, watchtowers spaced at intervals, and a citadel perched high on Mount Silpius, dominating the city and the surrounding plain. Inside its walls, the Seljuk governor Yagisiyan commanded a garrison of Turks, Armenians, and other auxiliaries, while outside, the countryside was stripped bare to deny the besiegers supplies. The Crusaders, lacking siege engines at first, tried to encircle the city with fortified camps, but the ring was incomplete. The Orontes River cut across one side, and the defenders used this gap to smuggle in food and reinforcements. As the weeks passed, autumn rains turned the ground to mud. Men shivered in sodden tents. Sickness spread. Horses died by the hundreds. Chronicler Raymond of Aguilers recalled that hunger so tormented us that many boiled the hides of beasts for food. Some knights pawned or sold their weapons for bread. Even so, there were flashes of savagery. Raiding parties clashed beyond the walls, and prisoners were sometimes executed within sight of the enemy. By January 1098, the Crusaders had managed to build siege engines, towering wooden constructions covered in hides to resist fire, and great rams to batter the gates. Yet Yagisian's sorties were fierce. One night, his forces fell upon the Crusader camp of Bohemond of Taranto, setting fires and cutting down men as they fled. The ring tightened only when Bohemond's forces seized the iron bridge north of the city, cutting a vital supply route. The stalemate broke not through brute force, but treachery. Bohemond, ambitious and politically shrewd, struck a secret deal with an Armenian Christian named Firuz, a commander of one of Antioch's towers. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, under the cover of darkness, Firuz lowered ropes for Bohemond's picked men. Climbing silently, they overpowered the guards and threw open a gate. At dawn, Crusaders poured into the city, and chaos erupted. Fighting raged through the streets, the clash of steel echoing between stone walls. Yagisian fled but was captured and beheaded by local villagers. By midday, the Crusaders held Antioch, yet their victory was fleeting. Only a day later, the great Muslim general Kaboga of Mosul arrived with a massive relief army, estimated by chroniclers at tens of thousands. Now the Crusaders, exhausted and bloodied, found themselves the besieged. The food stores were almost gone. Disease gnawed at the camp. Morale collapsed. Some even slipped away under cover of darkness, abandoning the cause. It was then that a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions of St. Andrew, revealing the location of the Holy Lance. The spear said to have pierced Christ's side. Digging in the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, they unearthed a lance head, and whether by miracle or careful staging, the effect on morale was electric. Chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote, "With tears of joy, the people cried out to God, and our hearts burned with the fire of battle." On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched from the gates in battle order, banners snapping in the wind, armor gleaming in the morning sun. The army advanced in tight formation, chanting prayers as priests walked among the ranks with relics held high. Kaboga's troops launched a storm of arrows, but the Crusaders held their line, then surged forward with lances couched. Shocked by the ferocity of the charge and riven by dissension among his own emirs, Kaboga's army began to falter. What began as an orderly withdrawal became a rout. By noon, the relief force had scattered, leaving the Crusaders masters of Antioch. The victory at Antioch was both a triumph and a turning point. It proved that the Crusaders could survive against overwhelming odds, but it also revealed the fragility of their unity. Victory had come as much from luck, faith, and treachery as from strategy. And for the men who would one day form the Knights Templar, Antioch stood as a warning that even the strongest walls can fall, and that in the Holy Land, the besieger could become the besieged overnight. Better to die with honor than to live with shame. Chronicler of the Siege of Antioch, Gesta Francorum. By the summer of 1099, the Crusader army, battered but unbroken after the long ordeal at Antioch, finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The city rose from the Judean hills, its golden light dazzling in the morning sun. But the sight brought no easy joy. The walls were formidable. Massive stone ramparts punctuated by high towers, built upon steep slopes that made any assault a labor of blood. The holy city was in the hands of the Fatimid Caliphate, and its governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, commanded a determined garrison. Knowing the Crusaders were coming, the defenders had poisoned wells, destroyed cisterns outside the city, and stripped the surrounding countryside of food and forage. The army that had marched for 3 years now faced the most sacred and the most desperate siege of all. At first, the Crusaders were ill-prepared. They had no siege engines, no ladders, no rams, only the will to fight and the certainty that time was against them. The summer sun beat down with merciless heat. Men drank brackish water from distant springs, sometimes fighting each other for a mouthful. Chronicler Fulcher of Chartres recalled, "The heat was great and the water scarce, and men dropped where they stood for thirst. For nearly a month, they tried small-scale assaults, archers loosing shafts against the walls, while scaling attempts were beaten back with stones, boiling oil, and flaming pitch." It was at this moment of frustration that the Crusaders' leaders, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Tancred, ordered the construction of great siege towers and battering rams. From the coastal port of Jaffa came timber, dragged by oxen across the hills. Under the direction of engineers, the Crusaders worked day and night, fashioning immense wooden towers clad in hides to resist fire. The defenders answered with taunts from the walls, calling the Crusaders beggars and fools, even displaying the cross of Christ in mockery. On July 13th, the assault began in earnest. Godfrey's siege tower rolled toward the northern wall near the Damascus Gate, while Raymond attacked from the south. The noise was like thunder, battering rams slamming against gates, arrows hissing through the air, the shouts of men urging the towers forward over uneven ground. From the walls, defenders dropped stones the size of mill wheels, hurled javelins, and set fire to anything they could reach. The Crusaders countered with crossbow volleys and stones from mangonels, forcing the defenders back long enough to edge the towers closer. 2 days later, on July 15th, Godfrey made his decisive move. In the night, he had the tower dismantled and rebuilt closer to the section of wall where the defences were weakest. At dawn, his men pushed it forward under a storm of arrows and burning pitch. Near midday, a Crusader knight named Leithold of Tournai leapt from the tower's drawbridge onto the wall, followed by a flood of warriors. They cut down the defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat, forcing their way into the city. At almost the same moment, Raymond's men broke through the southern gate. What followed was both triumph and horror. Fulcher of Chartres wrote, "It was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers." The streets ran red as the Crusaders swept through, killing combatants and civilians alike. Some chroniclers spoke of such slaughter that men waded in blood up to their ankles. The massacre spared few. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians were caught in the chaos. Yet amid the carnage, the purpose of the crusade was fulfilled. Barefoot and still armed, the leaders of the army made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There they knelt at the tomb of Christ, weeping openly. The city, long prayed for and fought over, was in Christian hands. Godfrey refused the title of king, instead taking the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, declaring that he would not wear a crown of gold where his Saviour had worn a crown of thorns. The victory at Jerusalem was the high point of the First Crusade, but it was also the moment when the Crusaders realized how exposed they were. The city was surrounded by enemies, the roads to it perilous, and the garrisons too small to defend the new kingdom against constant raids. In the decades ahead, these conditions would give birth to the Knights Templar, a permanent, disciplined force sworn to protect the Holy Land and those who journeyed to it. In 1119, Hugh de Paynes and 8 companions swore to defend pilgrims. King Baldwin II gave them quarters on the Temple Mount. Bernard of Clairvaux praised them in praise of the new knighthood. When they fight not for self, but for Christ. When they strike, they smite not a man but the wickedness that rules him. The Templars became the mailed fist of the Latin East. At Montgisard in 1177, King Baldwin IV, ravaged by leprosy, rode with perhaps 500 knights, including Templars, against Saladin's 20,000. They struck in the heat of the day, the Templars forming the tip of the spear. Saladin's lines shattered. His army fled, abandoning its banners. Ernul recorded, "The hand of God was upon the field that day. Let the sword of the knight be bathed in prayer before it is bathed in blood." From Bernard's teachings on the spiritual life of a knight. At Hattin, the summer of 1187 was one of the most fateful in the history of the Crusader states. For years, tensions had been rising between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Sultan Saladin, who had united Egypt and Syria into a single formidable empire. Raids and counter-raids had flared along the frontiers, but the fragile truce collapsed when Reynald de Chatillon, Lord of Kerak, attacked a Muslim caravan travelling under safe conduct. Saladin took it as a personal insult and a religious provocation. He gathered his forces, tens of thousands of cavalry and infantry from across his domains and began the march into the Latin kingdom. In late June, Saladin laid siege to the city of Tiberias, drawing the Crusader army away from their stronghold at Sephoria. The king, Guy of Lusignan, assembled the host of the kingdom. The Templars under Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort, the Hospitallers, the knights of the royal household, barons, mercenaries, and foot soldiers. It was a formidable force by Crusader standards, but far smaller than Saladin's army. The military orders provided the hard core of disciplined cavalry. The Templars, as ever, the shock troops of the realm. Against the counsel of more cautious commanders like Raymond III of Tripoli, King Guy decided to march toward Tiberias to relieve the siege. The decision would prove disastrous. Saladin's forces controlled the wells and springs along the route, and his light cavalry shadowed the Crusader column, harassing it with arrows, cutting down stragglers, and driving off supply animals. Under the merciless July sun, the Crusaders' water supplies dwindled. Chronicler Anul wrote, "The heat was great and the water lacking, and the Saracens unceasingly rained arrows upon us, so that our horses fell and our men fainted from thirst." By the evening of July the 3rd, the Crusaders had reached a parched plateau near an extinct volcanic formation known as the Horns of Hattin, a pair of steep hills rising above the plain. They camped there, their throats dry, their spirits low. During the night, Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass and brush on the windward side of the Crusader camp. Smoke and heat rolled in with the dawn, choking the soldiers and their horses. The defenders awoke to find themselves encircled. Saladin's army had formed a living ring of steel and fire. At first light on July 4th, Saladin tightened the noose. His archers advanced in waves, loosing clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. The Crusader cavalry, desperate to break out, launched repeated charges. First the Templars, then the Hospitallers. These charges were feats of courage, but failed to pierce the Muslim lines. Each time, the heavily armoured knights crashed into the swirling ranks of Saladin's horsemen, only to be enveloped and driven back with losses. The heat was unbearable. The wounded cried for water. Horses foamed at the mouth and collapsed. Chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing from the Muslim perspective, noted, "They were like birds in a cage, unable to escape, and the fire of thirst consumed them." By mid-morning, the Crusader army was in disarray. The infantry huddled on the slopes of the Horns, a press of men beneath the banners of the True Cross, which the Bishop of Acre carried into battle. Saladin's forces pressed harder, their drums pounding, their war cries echoing across the hills. In one final effort, the Templars and the Royal Knights attempted to cut through the encirclement toward the waters of Lake Tiberias. They were met by a wall of lances and arrows, and most were cut down. By midday, the Crusader position collapsed. The True Cross was captured, a devastating spiritual and symbolic blow. King Guy was taken prisoner, along with much of the high command. Saladin spared Guy's life, offering him cool water to drink, a gesture of respect. But when Renaud de Chatillon was brought before him, Saladin personally struck him down for breaking the truce. The surviving Templars and Hospitallers were executed on Saladin's orders. Muslim chroniclers note that he saw them as dangerous fanatics who would never yield in battle. Baha ad-Din wrote, "The Sultan ordered that they should be struck down, and not one of them escaped the sword." The Battle of Hattin was a catastrophe for the Crusader states. Within months, Saladin's forces swept across the kingdom, capturing Acre, Jaffa, and finally Jerusalem itself. For the Templars, Hattin was both a tragedy and a crucible. Saladin ordered the execution of the Templar and Hospitaller prisoners. Baha ad-Din wrote, "Not one of them escaped the sword." decimated their ranks, yet in the years that followed, they would rebuild, becoming once again the hard, unyielding edge of Christendom's armies in the Holy Land. That same year, Jerusalem fell again. Saladin's siege engines pounded the walls, scaling ladders swarmed with warriors. Inside, the defenders fought street by street, the clamour of steel echoing through the narrow lanes. Knowing the city could not hold, Balian of Ibelin negotiated terms. Saladin spared the populace for ransom, a decision remembered even by his enemies. The loss of Jerusalem summoned the Third Crusade. In 1191, Richard the Lionheart joined the Templars at the siege of Acre. The air was choked with dust from constant bombardment. Stones from trebuchets crashed into walls. Bolts from giant crossbows tore through shields. The Templars held the front lines in rotation, their white mantles stained with dust and sweat. When Acre fell, Richard turned to face Saladin's army in the field. At Arsuf, for hours, Richard's forces endured relentless attacks. Saladin's cavalry swept in, loosing arrows, then retreating before countercharge. The Templars, positioned on the right wing, held formation despite the cries of their war horses and the sting of arrows. Finally, at Richard's signal, they charged in perfect order, lances levelled, breaking Saladin's flank. Ambrose recorded, "The earth shook under the hooves, and the air was filled with the cries of the fallen. Never was charge more fearsome. We fight for Christ, and in his strength we shall overcome 1,000. Richard I, attributed during the Third Crusade. It was said that Richard I and Saladin had some level of respect for one another, and each understood the other to be a formidable opponent. Though they never stood face to face, Saladin and Richard I, the Lionheart, came to know one another through steel and strategy during the Third Crusade. Across the fields of Arsuf, Jaffa, and countless skirmishes, they matched wits and will. Richard's charges were swift and devastating. Saladin's cavalry was fluid and tireless. Yet amid the brutality, there was chivalry. When Richard fell ill at Jaffa in 1192, Saladin sent him peaches, pears, and ice from the mountains, along with his own physician. The Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din wrote, "The King of England fell ill, and the Sultan sent him fruits and snow to cool his drinks, and prayed for his recovery." On the battlefield, Richard recognized in Saladin a worthy opponent, once declaring, "If I must lose my lands, I would wish no one but Saladin to be their lord." Saladin returned the respect. Watching Richard's unyielding spirit, he told his own court, "Never have I known such a man. He is the bravest and most gallant of our enemies." Their rivalry became a kind of dialogue in arms, each testing the other's limits, each responding with honor. When they finally made peace through the Treaty of Jaffa, it was not born of weakness but of recognition. Pilgrims were granted safe passage to Jerusalem, the holy city remaining in Muslim hands but open to Christian devotion. In that truce was an unspoken acknowledgement. The war between them was as much a contest of character as of kingdoms, and in the other, each had found the rarest of foes, a worthy one. In 1244, at Forbie, Templars fought alongside Hospitallers and the forces of Jerusalem against a Khwarezmian Turkish host allied with Egypt. The Christian lines held for 2 days, the Templars anchoring the centre. On the third day, the enemy broke through. Surrounded, the Templars fought to the last. Nearly the entire Christian army was destroyed. In 1291, Acre, the last great Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, came under siege by the Mamluks. For weeks, Templars fought from the walls, manning towers under ceaseless bombardment. trebuchets hurled stones by day and night. Sappers undermined the walls. When the final breach came, the fighting raged from street to street. The Templar fortress by the sea became the last point of resistance, holding out for days after the city had fallen. When it finally collapsed, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was gone. Their white mantles marked with red crosses were more than symbols. They were a promise that someone would stand between the innocent and the sword. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar stood as the mailed guardians of the Latin East, riding at the forefront of battle, holding the walls of fortresses against overwhelming odds, and protecting the roads where pilgrims walked in the shadow of danger. But they were more than soldiers. They were the living answer to centuries of history, born in the wake of the Islamic Caliphate's rise, forged in the crucible of the First Crusade, and tempered in battle against empires and sultans. From the fall of Jerusalem in 638, through the Seljuk ascendants, to the campaigns of Saladin and the Mamluks, the tide of history had been sweeping steadily against Christendom. The Templars were that rare and desperate response, an order of men bound by vows who turned their very lives into a wall of steel. They were created because the roads to Jerusalem bled. They endured because the frontiers trembled. They fought because without them, the Latin kingdoms would have been swept away in a single generation. From Montgisard to Arsuf, from Forbie to Acre, they proved again and again that a disciplined brotherhood could change the course of a battle, hold a fortress long enough for civilians to flee, and buy years of survival for a fragile kingdom. Their fortresses were not only walls of stone, but symbols carved into the land. Safed, Tortosa, Gaza, each one a promise to the people living under its shadow that someone would stand between them and destruction. Medieval chroniclers, even in their own day, understood the gravity of their task. Bernard of Clairvaux, their great champion, wrote, "Knights of Christ, they go forward undaunted, fearing neither the number nor the strength of the barbarians, for they put their trust in the Lord of hosts." And the modern historian Malcolm Barber reminds us, in the Latin East, the Templars were the professional garrison, the fixed points of resistance around which all else moved. They are gentler than lambs in the cloister, fiercer than lions on the battlefield. Bernard of Clairvaux, in praise of the new knighthood. Theirs was not an easy glory. Many fell in dust and heat far from home. Many endured years of hardship for battles that would never be sung beyond the walls of a small church in their native village. But in the great sweep of history, they became something more than men. They became the embodiment of a people's will to hold the line against the rising tide. They were the watch on the walls, the shield before the faithful, the hammer in the charge, and the last banner to fall. As we look back across these centuries, we see not just the wars they fought, but the cause they served. The Templars were born in an age when the frontiers of faith were guarded by flesh and blood, and when the fate of kingdoms could rest on the charge of a few hundred horsemen in white mantles, marked with a red cross as an answer to the Islamic incursion. True heroes. If you've enjoyed this journey into the rise of the Knights Templar and their epic stand against the tides of history, I invite you to help keep stories like this alive. Please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Lilly's Viking Adventure for more deep dives into history's most fascinating warriors, battles, and legends. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, visit our Etsy store, Viking Adventure Gifts, where you'll find unique Norse-inspired and medieval-themed treasures. The link is in the description below. Your support helps us keep creating, researching, and bringing you these epic tales from the past.
Yeah.